Cole Warren was not the kind of man anyone remembered. He was 43 years old, average in every way that the galaxy seemed to measure people. Not tall, not short. Not loud, not particularly funny. He had a round, tired face, hands that were rough from years of work, and eyes that were the quiet brown of someone who had long ago made peace with being overlooked. He wore a gray maintenance uniform with the Veyrath Station logo stitched on the left chest, and he pushed a cleaning cart that squeaked slightly on the left wheel no matter how many times he oiled it. 3 years he had worked the night shift on Veyrath Station. 3 years of the same corridors, the same hum of the ventilation systems, the same distant sounds of ships docking and departing far above him on the upper levels. While the rest of the station slept or drank or conducted important business in gleaming halls, Cole moved through the lower decks in the dark and the quiet, mopping floors that nobody looked at and fixing vents that nobody thanked him for. The station itself was enormous. If you had never seen it before, the size of it could stop your breath. It orbited a pale gas giant at the edge of a busy travel corridor, and ships from 100 different worlds passed through it every single day. The upper decks were full of light and noise and color. There were restaurants and trading halls and diplomatic lounges where species that had once gone to war with each other now sat and argued over contracts instead. There were observation decks with views of the stars that made people go quiet just from looking. Cole had been to the observation deck exactly twice in 3 years. Both times alone. Both times on his break. He preferred the lower decks. Not because they were pleasant. They were not. The lower maintenance levels of Veyrath Station were cold and poorly lit and smelled of metal and old machinery. The ceilings were low. The corridors were narrow. The heating systems down here were old and unreliable, and Cole had submitted 17 separate maintenance requests about them in the past year alone. 6 had been acknowledged. 2 had actually been acted on. But the lower decks were quiet. And in the quiet, Cole could think or not think, which was sometimes better. He could do his work carefully and completely without anyone standing over him or past him or through him like he was not there. On this particular night he was working his way through Corridor 14. Corridor 14 was not a place anyone came on purpose. It was a long, dim stretch of lower deck used mostly for storing freight containers that had been left behind by ships passing through. Some of the containers had been there so long that Cole genuinely did not know if anyone remembered they existed. He cleaned this corridor every third night not because it ever got particularly dirty but because it was on his list and Cole was the kind of man who did what was on his list. He pushed his cart slowly along the right side of the corridor, the squeaky wheel marking his pace in the silence. His breath came out in faint clouds. The heating vent above Corridor 14 had been broken for 2 weeks. Cole had submitted a request. It had not been acknowledged. He was about halfway down the corridor when he stopped. He stood very still and listened. There was a sound. It was coming from somewhere behind the far stack of containers, the tall row pushed up against the left wall near the end of the corridor. The sound was thin, fragile, high in pitch in a way that made it hard to locate at first, like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Cole left his cart where it was and walked slowly toward the containers. The sound grew clearer as he got closer. It was not one sound. It was several layered over each other, weaving in and out. Each one trembled at the edges like something that had been going on for a long time and was running low on strength. Cole knew that sound. Not because he had heard it before from creatures like these, but because he had heard it before from creatures in general. He had grown up on a farm on the edge of a small town, and he had spent enough cold nights in barns with young animals to know what it sounded like when something small and frightened had been alone too long. He squeezed between the last 2 container stacks and came around the corner. And he stopped. There were 3 of them. Dragon hatchlings. Tiny, impossibly small, pressed together against the cold metal wall at the very end of the corridor where the broken vent blew nothing but cold air. Their scales were pale and soft in the way that very new scales are, still carrying that fragile quality of something that has not fully hardened yet. One was a faint green, one was darker, almost gray, and the third, the smallest of the 3 by a noticeable amount, was the pale silver of early morning light. Their eyes were barely open. Their bodies were pressed so tightly together that it was hard to tell where one ended and the next began. They were shaking. Not gently. Badly, the deep full body kind of shaking that comes from cold that has been going on too long. Their small mouths were open and the sound Cole had been following was coming from all 3 of them at once. That thin high trembling cry that now, up close, landed somewhere in the middle of his chest and sat there heavily. Cole looked around the corridor. He looked left and right and behind him and up toward the ceiling as if somehow he had missed something. There was no one. No adult. No guardian. No handler. No sign that anyone had been here recently at all. Just the cold and the dark and the broken vent and 3 hatchlings who had clearly been here for a long time already. He looked back at them. The smallest one, the silver one, had lifted its head slightly when Cole came around the corner. It was looking at him now with eyes that were too large for its face, the way young creatures' eyes always seem too large, filled with something that was not quite hope yet but was reaching in that direction. Cole did not think about regulations. He did not think about whether he was supposed to touch them or whether there was a protocol for this or whether he should wait for someone with the proper authority and the proper training and the proper forms to fill out afterward. He thought about how cold the floor was under his own boots and how long these 3 small things must have been sitting on it. He knelt down slowly, bringing himself to their level so he would not seem large and frightening coming from above. He held out one hand, open, palm up, and waited. The silver one looked at his hand for a moment. Then it made a sound that was different from the crying, smaller, and leaned forward and pressed the top of its head against his fingers. Cole very carefully picked it up. It weighed almost nothing. It fit against his palm and forearm like it had been made to go there. The moment it was against the warmth of his skin it went very still, and he felt the shaking begin, slowly, to ease. He reached back for the other 2. They came to him without much resistance, the way creatures do when they are past the point of having the energy to be afraid of anything new. He gathered all 3 of them carefully and stood up. He unzipped his work jacket with one hand, the thick worn one with the station logo on the back, and tucked all 3 of them inside it against his chest. He zipped it back up loosely, enough to keep them enclosed, his arms holding the weight of them from underneath. The crying stopped. It did not stop all at once. The gray one settled first, then the green. Then the silver one pressed its nose against the left side of Cole's chest, right where his heart was, and let out one long slow breath that had clearly been held for a very long time. And went quiet. Cole stood in the cold corridor for a moment, just breathing. He could feel 3 small heartbeats against his own, fast and light and gradually steadying. He reached carefully for his communicator and called station management, keeping his voice low. He was going to need some help down here. But he was not going anywhere until it arrived. The communicator beeped twice before anyone picked up. Cole stood in the cold corridor with 3 hatchlings tucked against his chest, one hand holding the communicator and the other arm wrapped around the outside of his jacket, keeping the weight of them steady. He could feel them breathing. Slow and small and gradually becoming more regular, like 3 tiny engines finding their rhythm again after running too rough for too long. The voice that answered was tired and a little irritated in the way that night shift desk workers everywhere in the galaxy tended to sound after the 3rd hour of a quiet shift. Veyrath Station Management. What is your request? This is Cole Warren, he said, keeping his voice low and even. Maintenance, night shift, lower decks. I am in Corridor 14. I need someone down here. I have found 3 Veiltheri hatchlings. They are alive but they have been in the cold for a while and they need attention. There was a pause on the other end. A longer one than Cole expected. Then the voice came back and it had changed slightly. Still tired but with something new underneath it. A kind of careful, uncertain quality like someone who had just been handed a problem they did not have a form for. You said Veiltheri? Yes. Another pause. Cole heard the sound of fingers moving quickly over a console. He shifted his weight slightly and felt the silver hatchling adjust against his chest in response, pressing in closer without waking. Mr. Warren, we are aware of the situation involving the Veiltheri transport vessel. There was an incident earlier this evening. The adults are currently being treated in the medical bay on Deck 7. The hatchlings were logged as secured in a temperature-controlled container that was routed to the family quarters on Deck 4. Cole looked around at the cold corridor. At the broken vent. At the frost forming in the corner where the wall met the floor. They are not on Deck 4, he said. The system shows them as. They are in Corridor 14 on the lower maintenance level, Cole said, still calm, still quiet. The heating vent in this corridor is broken. I submitted a repair request for it 14 days ago. It has not been fixed. The temperature down here is well below what any hatchling should be sitting in, and from the look of them they have been here for several hours at minimum. The pause this time was the longest yet. When the voice came back it had shifted again, carrying now the particular tone of someone who was beginning to understand the size of the mistake that had been made on someone else's watch. I see. Mr. Warren, I am going to need to notify the appropriate department and locate a qualified Veiltheri handler to come and collect the hatchlings. In the meantime, please leave them in place and... No, Cole said. A short silence. I'm sorry? I am not leaving them in place, Cole said. He said it the same way he said everything, without heat, without drama. Just plainly like he was reading something off a list. It is cold down here and they have already been alone for too long. I will stay with them until someone qualified arrives. I'm not going anywhere and I am not putting them back on the floor. You can note that in whatever form you need to fill out. There was a longer silence on the other end. Cole could almost hear the desk worker trying to find the regulation that covered this exact situation and coming up empty. Mr. Warren, technically the protocol for non-registered personnel in contact with high-status alien young is. I understand, Cole said. Please send someone as fast as you can. Cole Warren, Corridor 14, lower maintenance level. I will be here. He ended the call. He lowered himself carefully to the floor, moving slowly so the hatchlings would not be disturbed, and settled his back against the freight container behind him. The metal was cold through his uniform shirt, but he had been cold before and it did not particularly bother him. He adjusted his arms so that the jacket was fully supported from underneath, the three small bodies inside it rising and falling with his breathing. The silver one was fully asleep now. He could tell from the way its weight had gone completely soft and trusting, the way sleeping creatures went boneless in a way they never quite did when they were just resting. The gray one was somewhere between sleep and waking, its eyes half open, its small body occasionally twitching with the memory of shivering even though the shivering itself had stopped. The green one was the most awake of the three. It had worked its head free from the top of his jacket and was looking around the corridor with the slow, blinking attention of something that was still very young and very tired but was trying to understand where it was. Cole looked at it. It is all right, he said quietly. You are okay now. The green one looked at him for a moment with those two large eyes. Then it put its chin down on the edge of his jacket and watched the corridor with him, as if it had decided that as long as he was watching it too then things were probably fine. Cole sat with them in the quiet. He thought about the call he had just made and the response he had gotten and the 14 maintenance requests sitting in the system, most of them unread, some of them acknowledged with a standard reply that meant nothing was going to happen anytime soon. He thought about the temperature-controlled container that the system had logged as delivered to Deck 4 when it was sitting in the lowest, coldest part of the station instead. He thought about how many hours the word several actually meant when a tired desk worker used it. He did not feel angry exactly. He had worked on stations and in facilities long enough to know that systems failed and mistakes happened and paperwork got lost and things fell through the gaps between one department and another. It was not malice. It was just the ordinary, grinding failure of large organizations to keep track of small things. The problem was that the small things in his jacket were not small in any way that actually mattered. He checked his communicator again. He had been in Corridor 14 for 40 minutes now. He sent a follow-up message to station management asking for a status update on the handler and on getting the heating vent in this corridor repaired as an emergency priority, given the current circumstances. He kept the message polite. He always kept his messages polite. It cost nothing and it occasionally made a difference. No reply came. He put the communicator away and settled in. Time passed in the way it did on night shifts, slowly and then not at all, the minutes blurring into each other in the low hum of the station systems. Cole sat on the cold floor and held 3 dragon hatchlings against his chest and listened to them breathe. Somewhere far above him the station continued its busy, important, brightly lit existence. Ships came and went. Deals were made. Languages were spoken and translated and spoken again. The galaxy moved at its usual pace, enormous and indifferent. Down here there was just Cole and the squeaky wheel of his abandoned cart 20 meters up the corridor and the soft sound of 3 small creatures sleeping. At some point the green one fell asleep too. Its chin slipped off the edge of the jacket and it disappeared back inside with the other 2. Cole felt the shift of weight as it settled against its siblings. He checked his communicator again. An hour and 20 minutes since his first call. He sent another follow-up. Still polite. Slightly more specific about the urgency this time. He got a reply 6 minutes later. A handler had been located and notified. Someone was on the way. Estimated arrival was unclear due to the handler needing to travel from the medical bay where the adult Veiltheri were being treated. Cole read the message and put the communicator back in his pocket. He leaned his head back against the freight container and closed his eyes, not to sleep but just to rest them. He kept his arms steady. He kept his breathing slow and even, the same rhythm it had been since he first sat down, because he had noticed early on that the hatchling's breathing had matched itself to his and he did not want to change anything that was working. The corridor was still cold. The vent still rattled uselessly above him. But against his chest, in the worn old jacket with the station logo on the back, 3 small creatures were warm and quiet and safe. Cole stayed exactly where he was. He had said he would. That was enough. The footsteps came long before the elder did. Cole heard them in the way you hear things when you are not fully asleep but not fully awake either. That soft in-between place where sounds reach you but your body has not yet decided whether they are worth responding to. Heavy footsteps. Slow and deliberate. The kind that came from something large that was choosing its pace carefully rather than something large that was simply moving without thinking. He had been in that half-sleep for a while now. At some point during the long wait, without quite meaning to, he had drifted. Not deeply. Just enough that the cold floor under him had stopped registering and the hum of the station systems had faded to a background texture rather than an actual sound. His back was still against the freight container. His arms were still in position. His breathing was still slow and steady. The hatchlings had moved in the way sleeping creatures always moved when left undisturbed for long enough. The green one had worked its way out of the jacket at some point and was now curled in the space between Cole's crossed legs, tucked into the warmth of his lap with its tail wrapped neatly around itself. The gray one had climbed higher while he slept, and was now draped across his right shoulder like it had decided that was simply where it lived. Cole could feel the small weight of it against the side of his neck, the faint warmth of its breath near his ear. And Ash, the silver one, the smallest, was tucked under his chin. Cole did not know when that had happened. At some point the hatchling had climbed from inside the jacket and found its way up and settled in that narrow warm space between his jaw and his chest, and it was there now, deeply asleep, its tiny body rising and falling with each breath Cole took. He could feel the faint vibration of it against his throat. Not quite a sound. More like the memory of one. The footsteps stopped. Cole opened his eyes slowly. He saw her at the end of the corridor. Elder Sarah was not what he had been picturing when station management told him a Veiltheri handler was on the way. He had imagined something like a staff member. Someone in a uniform, carrying a case, moving with the brisk efficiency of a professional doing a job. What was standing at the end of Corridor 14 was something else entirely. She was enormous. That was the first thing, and it was impossible to look past. She filled the corridor in a way that made the space feel suddenly smaller, the high-stacked containers on either side of her seeming less impressive than they had before. Her scales were silver, deep and old silver, the kind that had layers to it, that shifted slightly when she moved between the different angles of the corridor lighting. She was not the pale new silver of Little Ash. She was the silver of something that had been through a great deal of weather and come out the other side still standing. She had treatment patches along the left side of her neck and partway down her shoulder. 3 of them, square and white against the scales. She was holding herself straight, but Cole could see, even half awake, that it was costing her something. The kind of straight that was a decision rather than a natural state. She had stopped at the end of the corridor and she was not moving. Cole looked at her. She looked at him. Her eyes were extraordinary. Large and amber gold and carrying in them the particular quality that very old eyes sometimes had, the quality of having seen so many things that they had stopped being surprised by most of them. But they were not calm right now. They had been, Cole thought. Whatever expression she had walked through this station wearing since the accident, he suspected calm had been a large part of it. The controlled, deliberate calm of someone who was keeping themselves together through will alone. That calm was gone now. She was looking at him with an expression Cole did not have a complete name for. It was not one thing. It was several things happening at the same time, moving across her face like weather moving across open ground. Something that had been braced for impact hitting something it had not prepared for. Something that had been carrying a very heavy weight suddenly finding that the thing it had been carrying toward was not what it expected. Cole understood, in the slow way of someone still coming fully awake, what she had been expecting to find. She had come down here prepared. He could see that in the way she was standing, in the set of her shoulders, in the way her hands were slightly closed at her sides. She had made the walk from the medical bay on Deck 7 to the lower maintenance level while holding herself ready for something terrible. She had probably been doing that since the moment someone told her where the hatchlings had actually been routed. She had been preparing herself to find the worst. Instead she had found Cole. Cole, sitting cross-legged on the floor of a cold corridor, back against a freight container, with one hatchling in his lap and one draped across his shoulder and the smallest one tucked under his chin. All 3 of them deeply, quietly, peacefully asleep. All 3 of them as relaxed as it was possible for any creature to be. She stood at the end of the corridor and she did not move for a very long time. Cole did not rush to stand up. He moved carefully and slowly, aware of the 3 small sleeping bodies, aware that sudden movement would wake them and that waking them into confusion in a cold corridor was not something he wanted to do if he could avoid it. He shifted his weight gently. He lifted his chin slowly away from Ash, and the silver hatchling stirred but did not fully wake, making a small sound and pressing its nose instead against the front of his jacket. He looked up at the elder. He did not know what to say to her. He did not know the right words in her language or the right gesture or the right formal acknowledgement. He did not know Veiltheri customs or protocols or what was expected of him in this moment. He was a janitor from a farm town who had been sitting on a cold floor for a long time and was still not entirely awake. So he said the only thing that was true. They were scared, he said, his voice quiet so as not to disturb the hatchlings. I stayed. Elder Sarah looked at him. The expression on her face shifted again. The complicated weather of it moved and settled into something that was harder to read than any of the things that had come before it. Her amber-gold eyes moved from his face to the hatchling in his lap, then to the one on his shoulder, then to the silver one pressed against his jacket. She looked at each of them for a long moment. The careful, thorough look of someone checking, making absolutely certain before they allowed themselves to believe what they were seeing. All three of them were breathing. All three of them were warm. All three of them were so deeply asleep that even the sound of her arrival had not woken them, which meant they had been feeling safe for long enough that their bodies had fully let go. Something moved through Elder Sarah's face that Cole did not see because he was carefully repositioning Ash back inside his jacket while he waited for her to speak. He heard a sound above him. He looked up. Elder Sarah had lowered herself to her knees at the end of the corridor. Not quickly. Slowly, with the careful movement of someone whose injuries made certain positions difficult. She brought herself down until she was closer to his level and she stayed there and she held out her arms. Cole began the process of transferring the hatchlings one by one. He did it with the same care he had done everything else tonight. He lifted the green one from his lap first, both hands underneath, and placed it gently into the elder's waiting arms. Then the gray one from his shoulder, slowly, carefully. Then he unzipped his jacket and lifted Ash out last, the silver hatchling the smallest and the last to be moved, and placed it with the other two. Elder Sarah held all three against her chest. She looked down at them for a long moment. Then she looked at Cole, who was sitting on the empty floor now with his rumpled jacket across his knees and the small claw marks across the front of his uniform shirt. She still had not said anything. Cole did not push her. He sat quietly and waited and gave her whatever time she needed, the same way he had given the hatchlings whatever time they needed, because it seemed to him that this was simply what the moment required. He was good at waiting. He had been doing it all night. 3 days passed before Elder Sarah was well enough to stand fully without assistance. Cole did not know this. He had gone back to his shift the morning after Corridor 14, slept a few hours in his small quarters on the lower residential deck, and returned to work the following evening as he always did. His cart still squeaked on the left wheel. The floor of Corridor 9 still needed a second pass to come clean properly. The heating request he had submitted for the lower decks had finally, after the events of that night, been marked as urgent and was apparently being looked at by someone in the facilities department. Things were mostly the same. Except that they were not, quite. Small things had changed in ways Cole noticed but did not fully understand. The vendor near the east corridor who sold hot drinks from a cart and had never once looked in Cole's direction now nodded at him when he passed. A group of traders who usually took up the entire width of the corridor when they walked, forcing maintenance workers to press against the wall to let them by, moved aside for Cole without being asked. Nobody said anything about it. Nobody explained it. It just happened the way small shifts in a large place sometimes happened, quietly and without announcement. Cole filed it away and kept working. On the third day he received a formal message on his communicator. It was written in the common station language, translated from Veiltheri, and it was worded with the kind of careful formality that Cole associated with official documents and legal notices. It informed him that Elder Sarah of the Veiltheri requested his presence at a formal gathering to be held in the station's main meeting hall on Deck 3 at the 14th hour. His attendance was requested, not required. The distinction was noted specifically twice. Cole read the message standing in Corridor 11 with his mop in his hand. He read it again. Then he put his communicator away, finished the corridor, and went to find something clean to wear. He did not own anything formal. He had 2 sets of his maintenance uniform, both clean, and a plain gray shirt and dark trousers he wore on his days off when he walked the observation deck or ate in the lower residential canteen. He wore those. He looked at himself in the small mirror above his sink and decided that he looked like what he was, which was a maintenance worker who had been invited somewhere he did not usually go, and that there was nothing to be done about that and that it was probably fine. Deck 3 was not somewhere Cole spent time. It was part of the station's middle levels, where the administrative offices were and the larger meeting rooms used for interspecies negotiations and official functions. The corridors were wider up here and the lighting was warmer and the floors were a different material than the lower decks, something that did not show scuff marks the same way. Cole noticed this with the particular eye of someone who cleaned floors professionally. The main meeting hall was larger than he expected. It was not full, but it was not empty either. There were perhaps 30 people in the room when Cole arrived, standing in loose groups or seated in the curved rows of chairs that faced a low open area at the front. He recognized some of them as station administrators, senior staff members he had seen occasionally in the upper corridors. There were several Veiltheri present, adults, some of them still carrying the signs of the transport accident in the form of treatment patches and carefully held postures. There were a handful of other species Cole could not immediately identify, observers of some kind, people who had apparently heard about the gathering and come to see what it was. Cole found a place near the back and stood there quietly. He was the only person in the room wearing a gray shirt and plain trousers. He was fairly certain, the only janitor. Neither of these things particularly bothered him. He folded his hands in front of him and waited. Elder Sarah entered from a side door. She looked better than she had in Corridor 14. Still large, still silver-scaled, still carrying that quality of deep oldness and authority that seemed to be simply part of what she was. The treatment patches on her neck were fewer now, 2 instead of 3, and she was walking without the careful effortfulness of someone managing pain. She moved through the room with a steadiness that made the space arrange itself around her, people shifting slightly without thinking about it, the way people did near something that had serious weight to it. She took her place at the front of the room. She spoke first in Veiltheri. Cole could not understand the words, but he understood the quality of them. They were formal, measured, the kind of words that had structure and weight behind them, the kind of words that meant what they said and had been chosen carefully. The other Veiltheri in the room were very still while she spoke. Then she switched to the common tongue. She spoke clearly and without rushing, and the room was quiet enough that Cole could hear everything from where he stood at the back. She told them about the warming of a hatchling. She explained it the way you explain something to people who did not share your history, starting from the beginning and building it carefully. Among the Veiltheri, she said, the young were everything. Not in the easy way that people said such things, but in the deep structural way that shaped every part of their culture going back further than their written history. A hatchling that was frightened or cold or alone was in a state that every adult Veiltheri was shaped by instinct and tradition to respond to. To hold a frightened hatchling, to be the warmth it turned toward, to stay with it through the cold and the dark until it was safe, this was not a small gesture among her people. It was one of the most fundamental acts of kinship that existed in their culture. It was something that family did. Something that required trust so complete it went past thought entirely. The room was very quiet. Cole at the back was listening carefully. He was beginning to understand that something larger was happening here than he had walked in expecting. Elder Sarah turned and looked directly at him. She said his name clearly in the common tongue, so there was no confusion about who she was speaking to or speaking about. She said that 3 nights ago, a human maintenance worker named Cole Warren had found 3 Veiltheri hatchlings alone and cold and frightened in the lowest part of this station. She said that he had not waited for permission or protocol or the arrival of someone more qualified. She said that he had held those hatchlings through the night with his own warmth and had refused to leave them and had stayed until they were safe. She said that in the full tradition of her people, this act had a name and a meaning that could not be set aside simply because the one who performed it was not Veiltheri. She crossed the room toward Cole. Cole stayed where he was. He was not sure what else to do. Elder Sarah stopped in front of him. Up close she was very tall, and Cole had to look up slightly, which he did without any discomfort. She looked down at him with those amber gold eyes that carried everything they had ever seen in them. She spoke a word in Veiltheri. One word, short and clean. Then she translated it. Wormkeeper. She explained that the word meant, as closely as the common tongue could carry it, one who guards the fragile flame. She said it was not a title given to outsiders. She said it was not a political honor or a diplomatic gesture. She said it was something older and more specific than either of those things, and that she gave it now not because it was polite or because it smoothed relations between species but because it was accurate, and the Veiltheri did not use this word for people it was not accurate for. The room was completely silent. Cole looked at her for a moment. He could feel the attention of everyone in the room resting on him, waiting to see what he would do with something like this. He said, "Thank you. I am glad they are all right." He paused for just a moment. Then he said, "Are they eating enough? And are their quarters at the right temperature? The heating systems on this station have been unreliable. I want to make sure whoever is managing their rooms knows to check the vents specifically, not just the general temperature reading, because the sensors in this station's residential units do not always reflect the actual." The sound that came out of Elder Sarah stopped him mid-sentence. It started low in her chest and built quickly, rolling out of her in a wave that Cole felt as much as heard, deep and genuine and completely unguarded, filling the meeting hall from one end to the other. It was the first time she had laughed since before the accident, and everyone in the room could tell, because it had in it all the weight of everything that had been held back finally letting go. Cole waited politely for it to finish. He still wanted to know about the vents. 4 months was enough time for a station to forget most things. Verath Station was busy enough and large enough that stories moved through it quickly and were replaced by newer stories just as quickly. A shipment dispute on Deck 6. A diplomatic misunderstanding in the upper trading halls. A navigation system failure that delayed 17 vessels for 2 days and generated more paperwork than anyone wanted to think about. The galaxy kept moving and the station moved with it, and the things that had seemed remarkable a few months ago settled into the background of everything else that had happened since. The story of the human janitor and the Veiltheri hatchlings had not been forgotten exactly. It had just become one of those things that people on the station knew the way they knew other fixed features of the place, present and understood without needing to be discussed. Cole Warren, night shift maintenance, lower decks. The Wormkeeper. Yes, that one. Cole himself had not changed in any way he could specifically identify. He still pushed his cart. He still worked the night shift. He still submitted maintenance requests with careful descriptions and polite wording and varying degrees of response from the facilities department. The left wheel on his cart still squeaked, though he had now accepted this as a permanent feature rather than a problem to be solved. He had stopped oiling it 2 months ago and found that the silence of almost fixing it had been more frustrating than the noise of not fixing it at all. The small changes that had begun after that night in Corridor 14 had continued in their quiet way. They had not grown louder or more dramatic. They had simply become part of the texture of his days. A cleared path in a busy corridor. A meal left on his cart twice a week from the vendor near the South Dock who still would not hear of being paid. A general atmosphere in the lower decks of things being slightly more orderly and slightly less difficult than they had been before, in ways that nobody announced and nobody needed to. Cole accepted all of it with the same quiet manner he accepted most things. Gratefully, without making a fuss. On this particular evening he was working his way through the residential corridor on the lower middle deck, the long straight one that connected the maintenance access points to the smaller storage rooms near the east side of the station. It was not a dramatic corridor. It was the kind of corridor that existed in large stations purely out of necessity, the connecting tissue between places that mattered, straight and functional and lit just well enough to see by. Cole was about 2/3 of the way down it, pushing his cart at his usual pace, the squeaky wheel marking time against the floor, when something made him stop. He was not sure what it was at first. A sound, maybe, or the particular quality of silence that existed when something was present and waiting rather than when nothing was there at all. He had spent enough years working alone in quiet corridors at night to know the difference between empty and occupied, even when he could not immediately explain how he knew. He turned around. Ash was sitting in the middle of the corridor behind him. Cole went still. The hatchling had grown. Not dramatically, not in the way that would make you fail to recognize it, but noticeably, the way young creatures grew when they were well fed and warm and safe. The pale silver scales had deepened slightly, finding more color and more definition than they had carried in those first soft weeks. The eyes were the same, large and amber gold like the elders, watching Cole now with an expression of complete and settled calm. Ash was sitting very straight. Tail wrapped neatly around its front feet. Head up. The posture had a quality of dignity to it that seemed remarkable in something still so young, as if the hatchling had decided that this moment deserved to be conducted properly and had arranged itself accordingly. Cole looked at Ash. Ash looked at Cole. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Cole did what felt natural, which was to push his cart quietly to the side of the corridor so it was out of the way, and lower himself to the floor. He sat the same way he had sat in Corridor 14 4 months ago, cross-legged, back not quite against the wall, hands resting open on his knees. Ash watched this process with great attention. Then, with the same careful dignity it had been sitting with, it walked forward and sat down beside him. Not on him, not climbing or pressing the way it had in the cold of that first night. Just beside him. Close enough that Cole could feel the warmth of it against his left arm. Choosing proximity rather than requiring it. Cole looked at the hatchling beside him for a moment. Then he started talking. He talked the way he always talked when he had company he was comfortable with, which was quietly and about whatever was actually in his head rather than whatever seemed important enough to say out loud to most people. He talked about the vent in Corridor 9 that had started making a new sound last week, different from its old sound, a higher pitch that suggested the problem had moved from the motor to the coupling. which meant the previous repair had not actually addressed the root issue and he was going to have to submit another request and probably write a longer description this time to make sure whoever read it understood it was not the same problem as before. Ash listened. Not the polite half-listening of someone waiting for their turn to speak. Real listening. The kind where the body went still and the eyes stayed focused and the attention did not wander. Cole had met very few people in his life, human or otherwise, who listened the way Ash listened right now. He talked about the floor polish. There was a new supply shipment that had come in last month and the new polish was a different brand from the old one and it smelled different, sharper and less like the clean neutral smell he had gotten used to, and he was not yet sure if it was actually better or just different and he had been testing it on different floor materials to see if the results varied. Ash's head tilted very slightly to one side. Cole talked about a bird he had seen 3 mornings ago through the observation window at the end of the lower residential corridor. He did not know what kind of bird it was or how it had gotten onto the station or where it had come from, but it had been doing loops outside the window, wide easy loops with no apparent purpose, just flying in circles in the space between the station's outer hull and the docking scaffolding, and Cole had stood at the window for his entire break watching it because he could not figure out what it was doing and it had seemed very content doing it. Ash made a small sound. Not a word. Just a sound, low and brief, the kind that meant something was being registered and held. Cole looked at the hatchling beside him. "You are a good listener," he said. Ash looked up at him with those large steady eyes and Cole had the distinct impression, not for the first time in his life with animals and young creatures, that he was being understood considerably more specifically than he could prove. He did not know, sitting there in that ordinary corridor with the squeaky wheel cart parked beside him, that young Veiltheri listened this way for a very specific reason. He did not know that in their tradition the people a young Veiltheri chose to sit with and listen to in its early months were being memorized in a particular way, not just the words but the voice and the rhythm and the presence behind it, stored in a part of the memory that did not fade the way ordinary memories faded. He did not know that what Ash was doing right now was not casual. He just thought the hatchling seemed to like him and that this was a pleasant way to spend a break. At the far end of the corridor, in the shadow of the corridor junction where the light from both directions fell short, Elder Sarah stood and watched. She had not followed Ash here intentionally. She had simply been walking this corridor when she saw her grandchild slip away from the family quarters and come this direction, moving with that particular purposeful quiet that young Veiltheri used when they were going somewhere they had already decided to go. She had stopped and stayed back. She watched Cole sitting on the floor talking about floor polish and broken vents and a small bird flying in circles for no reason, and she watched Ash sitting beside him in the posture of genuine listening, and she stood there for a long time in the shadow of the corridor junction where neither of them could see her. Something settled in her chest. Something that had been sitting at an angle since the night of the accident, not quite right, not quite resolved, finally finding its proper place. She thought about what Cole had said in Corridor 14. 4 words, plain and simple, offered without any understanding of what they meant in her language or her culture or her long history. They were scared. I stayed. Elder Sarah stood in the shadow and watched her smallest grandchild sitting peacefully beside a quiet human on a corridor floor, and she made a decision that she had perhaps been moving toward since the moment she had first seen them together. She turned and walked back the way she had come, slowly and without hurrying. There was something she needed to do. Elder Sarah came to find Cole on a quiet morning. Not through a formal message this time. Not through station management or a written notice delivered to his communicator with careful wording and official stamps. She simply came herself, walking through the lower decks in the early hours when the night shift was winding down and the day shift had not yet fully begun, moving through the corridors that most of the station's important people never visited, until she found him. Cole was eating breakfast. He was sitting on the wide ledge below the observation window at the end of the lower residential corridor, the one where he had watched the bird doing loops 3 mornings ago. He had a container of food from the residential canteen and a cup of something warm, and he was looking out at the stars with the easy, unfocused attention of someone who was not thinking about anything in particular and was content with that. He heard the footsteps and looked up. Elder Sarah stopped a few feet away. She looked at him sitting on the ledge with his breakfast and his cup, and something in her expression was different from the other times Cole had seen her. The formal weight she usually carried, that quality of occasion and authority that seemed to be simply part of how she existed in a room, was still there, but it was sitting differently today. Further back. Like it was present but not in charge. She looked, Cole thought, like someone who had decided to say something honest. "May I sit with you?" she said. It was not quite a question and not quite a statement. Somewhere in between. Cole moved his food slightly to the side and gestured at the ledge. She lowered herself to sit across from him, which for a creature her size required a specific arrangement, but she managed it with the unhurried patience of someone who had long ago stopped being concerned about the practical difficulties of being large in spaces built for smaller beings. When she was settled, she looked out the observation window for a moment at the stars and the pale gas giant hanging in the distance and the slow drift of a cargo vessel moving away from the docking scaffolding on the far side of the station. Cole waited. He was good at waiting. He had his breakfast and his warm drink and he was in no hurry. Elder Sarah spoke without turning from the window at first. She told him she had seen Ash find him in the corridor 4 days ago. She said she had stayed back and watched, and she hoped he did not mind that she had not made herself known. Cole said he did not mind. She nodded slowly. She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned and looked at him directly and began to speak in the careful, considered way she spoke when she was saying something that mattered. She told him things about Ash that Cole had not known. She told him that of her 3 grandchildren, Ash had always been the quietest and the most careful. Not timid, she was clear about that distinction, but deliberate. Ash did not give attention easily or sit with people easily or choose company the way the other 2 did, openly and often. When Ash chose to be near someone, it meant something specific, and in their culture that specific thing had a name and a weight and a permanence that did not fade with time or distance. She told him that the night in Corridor 14, the cold and the fear and the long hours of it, had shaped something in Ash at the level where young Veiltheri were shaped most deeply. The warmth Ash had turned to in the dark. The heartbeat it had pressed against. The steady breathing it had matched its own breathing to while the cold stayed on the other side of a worn work jacket. These things did not sit in the ordinary part of memory for a young Veiltheri. They sat somewhere older and more permanent than that. Cole listened to all of this without interrupting. His breakfast sat untouched beside him. Elder Sarah told him that she had spent the months since the accident watching. Not suspiciously, not with doubt, but with the careful attention of someone who needed to be certain before they said the thing they were building towards saying. She had watched how Cole moved through his days. She had listened to what people on the station said about him, not the formal things, not the things people said because they were supposed to, but the small unguarded things people said about someone when they were not aware of being listened to. She had watched how Ash was when Cole was nowhere nearby and how Ash was when Cole was close. She had been certain for some time now. She told Cole about the Veiltheri family structure. Not the simple version, not the overview she had given in the meeting hall on Deck 3. The real version, the one that took longer to explain because it had more in it. She told him that their family bonds were not only about blood or origin. They never had been, not even in the oldest traditions. A Veiltheri family was built from those who had proven, through action rather than declaration, that they would stay. That they would hold the fragile things carefully. That they would sit on cold floors and refuse to leave and ask practical questions about heating vents when offered ancient honors. Cole was quiet for a moment when she said that last part. He looked at his cup. Then Elder Sarah said what she had come to say. She offered him a place within their family. Not a symbolic place. Not a diplomatic one. Not the kind of honorary position that large old families sometimes gave to outsiders to smooth relationships or acknowledge debts. She was specific and deliberate about this because she wanted there to be no confusion. She was offering him something that meant what it said and carried what it carried, the same as it would for anyone born into it or grown into it over years of shared living. She said he would be kin. Not a guest. Not a curiosity. Not a human that the Veiltheri were kind to because of what he had done. Kin. She said she was not asking because Ash needed it or because the family needed it. She was asking because it was true, and the Veiltheri did not let true things go unnamed simply because they were inconvenient or unusual. Then she stopped speaking and waited, the way she had learned from watching him that he sometimes needed a moment before he answered things that mattered. Cole looked out the observation window. The cargo vessel that had been pulling away from the docking scaffolding was gone now, swallowed by the distance and the dark between stars. The gas giant hung where it always hung, pale and enormous and patient. A small maintenance drone was moving along the outer hull of the station far below, doing whatever small maintenance drones did in the early morning when no one was watching. Cole turned his cup slowly in his hands. He asked one question. Would Ash be okay if I said no? Elder Sarah looked at him steadily. She said yes. Ash would be loved and whole and cared for. The family would go on. Ash would go on. A no from Cole would not break anything that could not be carried. Cole nodded. He looked at the cup in his hands for a moment longer. Then he looked up at her and said, Then I'll say yes. Because I want to. Not because they need me to. Elder Sarah was still. Not the stillness of someone who had not heard or was still processing. The stillness of someone who had just received something that landed exactly where it was aimed, in the specific place that had been waiting for it. She said, quietly and without any performance in it, that this answer was more veil theory than most veil theory she had known in her long life. She said it simply as a fact, the way she said things that were true. Cole looked slightly uncertain about what to do with that. He picked up his breakfast and offered her some without thinking about it, the automatic hospitality of someone who had grown up in a house where you always offered what you had to whoever was sitting near you. Elder Sarah looked at the container for a moment. Then she accepted a small amount, which was not something she needed but was something she understood the offering of. They sat together at the observation window in the quiet of the early morning and looked out at the stars. Below them, somewhere in the residential corridors of the lower decks, Ash was waking up. Starting a day that was the same as the day before in most ways and completely different in one way that would take years to fully unfold. Cole finished his breakfast. He had a shift to get to. Corridor 9 was not going to clean itself and the coupling on the vent was still making the wrong sound and he had a new maintenance request to write that was going to need a thorough description. He picked up his cart from where it was parked down the corridor. The left wheel squeaked against the floor. He pushed it forward into the quiet of the morning, and somewhere behind him in the corridor, he heard small claws on the metal floor. He smiled without turning around. He already knew who it was.